Okay, possibly one of the longer titles of this conference, Heisenberg and Hawthorne, measurements, visibility, and guidance. And the last word possibly should have been control, really, because that's also what this is about. Okay, so who am I then? Well, I can't boast quite as long as a career as Mike Williams did, but I was actually born when he started writing code, and started writing code 10 years after he did. Doing functional programming for about 30 years, and most of it in Lisp, of course. And yes, that's where the name comes from, actually. So, what I've done then, I've done a lot of teaching, actually. So, I can claim some of the responsibility for some of the software developers we have in this country, and I see some of them in this room as well. So I worked at the university for a long time, and doing teaching is of course actually a very good way of learning something. So, but after some 15 years or so, I thought maybe I'm actually done teaching, and maybe I can do something now as well. So I left the university, and after that I've been doing things like implementing Prolog, implementing the WAM, writing compilers, doing graphics, networks, networking, speech synthesis, some music notation, video decoding, some of it in Lisp, some of it in Prolog, and some of it in C and other languages. So yes, this talk is about technical debt, and for those of you who are at Mike Williams' talk, well, I can really agree with a lot of what he said about how things can go wrong, and I've also seen a lot of things go wrong as well during the years. So this is depending on your view and what it represents, this is a sort of a scary slide if it represents the complexity of your algorithms, because being exponential isn't very nice. You want to, it's sort of tolerable down here, bearable down here, and scary everywhere else. On the other hand, if this actually represents revenue, it's much nicer. And, well, these are sort of the years for Klarna, starting at 2005 and up to now. And, well, yes, our revenues and our growth has been exponential from the start. That's, of course, very nice from a revenue point of view, but it of course, brings on its own set of challenges, really. And we're running a 24/7 business where we have to be available all the time, taking purchases. And the actual number of transactions we handle each day, that is, number of purchases, isn't really too impressive in terms of, for example, comparing the number of transactions per second handled in a telecom switch or something like that. But the growth is more impressive. So growing exponential is, well, that's nice, and we're still doing it, essentially. So this probably means that, well, we are successful. And of course, we have a company of some 800 people today. And that probably means you've at least been doing the right things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing things right. And of course, this rapid growth comes with problems. So choosing the right technology, and of course we're all here because we assume that Erlang is the right technology, isn't really enough. You can write something bad in any language, and I've seen bad stuff in sort of most of the languages I've been working with. But what we have is a very fast growth, not only initially, but sort of all the time. So what we have is more merchants coming in, more end customers. We're expanding into new countries, and we're adding new products all the time. So from the start, we just had the simple invoice here in Sweden. And now we're present in 7 countries with additional products, checkout, and installments, etc., etc. So there's a lot of new challenges coming on all the time. And actually, entering a new country is also a bit of a challenge because, well, in Sweden, most of it was very easy because we have personal numbers. So as long as somebody gives us their personal number, we can get a lot of information very fast and very simple. This is not true in a lot of other countries, so that poses challenges. So since this track is about being agile, and I really liked, for those of you who were at Mike Williams' talk, in one of his agile slide, he actually had a picture of an agility dog, and well, this might actually be the backside of being sort of too agile. Because what we've had, and what we probably still have, is a very fast pace with a rather steady flow and high flow of new requirements. And developers, of course, as developers, we want to deliver on these expectations. We want to say, oh, yes, of course we can fix this. Of course we can implement this new feature, and, well, we can almost have it done by yesterday. And one way of doing that is, of course, to, well, cut some corners here and there. So this will mean that short-term delivery will be more important than long-term quality, long-term sustainability. And of course, in any instance, regardless of where you are, you'll try to solve your problems with your available resources. And okay, we do want more productivity. And with an exponential growth in revenue, we have a rather nice inflow of money. So we have money as our main resource. So what's happened is that we've been adding more developers all the time. And of course, having a lot of money makes it easy to add developers. It's not necessarily a good idea to add more developers just because you can. And of course, this has been known for an embarrassingly long time. So Fred Brooks' The Mythical Man Month, written in '75. If you haven't read it, I suggest you read it because it contains a lot of wisdom on how you should and what you should and should not do. And a lot of what Mike Williams talked about is reflected in this book. So this was known a long time ago. So essentially, well, since most of you, but not all, before you were born. But what happens if you add developers is that after a while, long-term quality and adaptability will suffer. And this slowdown is gradual. You won't see it that suddenly in one sprint or one quarter, your productivity just drops down. It's very much like the analogy of boiling a frog. Because if you take a frog, I haven't done this experiment myself, I just read about it. But if you put a frog into cold water and then turn on the heat, you will boil it because it won't notice the gradual change. But if you drop the frog into boiling water, it will do its best to get out of there. So adding more developers, especially if you've cut some corners along the way, means that things will slow down. And if you want to look at this, well, you can't just look at the productivity for the whole development department. You should look at it by normalizing against the number of developers you have. And there you might actually see that, oh, we're actually slowing down in terms of the productivity per developer, although we might be more productive as a department. And of course, well, here you can go into the discussion about evolution versus design, because What at least we have done, and I haven't been at Klarna for more than about 2 years, but I've seen the effects of this, and I've seen it continue to happen. Evolution is it means adaptation. It means adaptation to the environment, growing market changes, etc., etc. And of course, having something to adapt to, that's good, because it means you're successful. You have a market that wants your product, so that's nice. But all evolution will leave some kind of artifacts along the way. Just look at the human body. Most of us still have an appendix, and ideally, it would just sit there and do nothing, and just be harmless. But in the worst case, it will actually cause some harm and can kill you if it acts up at the wrong place. On the other hand, so evolution, especially fast evolution, will leave some artifacts. On the other hand, if you're doing design, well, yes, this will carry more purpose and some kind of sense of direction. But of course, adaptability might suffer because you don't know how you want to adapt in the future, which is somewhat problematic. So it's sort of not just one or the other. It's about being prepared for changes that might come, and especially learn from your mistakes. And if you see some kind of change happening more than one time, well, maybe you should try to adapt and say that this change is probably going to happen again. An example of that at Klarna is adaptation to countries. Doing a simple, quick and dirty adaptation for the first country is okay, because it's sort of seeing, well, can we do it, and can we make it work, and will we be successful in this first new country? Doing the second country in the same way is, well, possibly okay, but maybe not. And after that, you have to realize that we're probably going to grow not only to 7 countries, but possibly 10, 20, etc. So there, somewhere along that line, there is time for an abstraction. And of course, you can't design for every possible change. Well, as software developers say, of course you can. But that means you'll probably never ever get anything out on the market, because you're just waiting for this perfect product and say, we can't actually take care of this change yet, so we will just wait a bit. So what we have then is a history of evolution and adaptation. And after a while, so take care of small children. This is a scary picture, because this is what we get. No real detail in this, but this is actually a dependency graph. So this is sort of what nightmares are built of, really. So, and here is zooming in on some level of detail. The innocent are still protected. The guilty are still protected in this picture, because what we see is that, yes, we have a lot of dependencies between a lot of really, really small parts, and it's a great big mass, really. This means, yes, we have problems, and we have a lot of them. So I'll list some of the problems we have. Our dependencies are way too complex, which is very apparent from the previous picture. We've been growing very fast and not in a very structured way. So starting out with a small code base, and I do know we have some of the guilty parties from that small code base. Hello, Klacka, Johan. But I guess they left in time, really, too. But what happened was that the number of developers grew and the code base grew. And the necessary restructuring didn't really take place. So you can't manage, or you can't have a small company, run a small company in the same way as running a large company, and of course not vice versa either. So when you grow, both in terms of code base, domain, responsibilities, and developers, you have to put some kind of organization into place. This really didn't happen. It was very much when I came to Klarna for somewhat over 2 years ago that at that time there was something like 50 or 60 developers sharing one Git repository. And everybody sort of owned everything because, so I need to do a change here, and they did. And somebody else, actually I need to do a change over here, and they did. So ownership didn't exist really. Everybody owned everything. And the result of that is that you have a development that doesn't really scale because you have all these dependencies, and these dependencies grow all the time. The interconnectedness just grows, and it really gets horrible after a while. We had a lot of testing, and still do, which is done most at the system level, not at the unit level. So the parts are difficult to test in isolation. So one of the nice things with a system like Erlang, which is interactive, which can do code loading on the fly, is that you can ideally have very short turnaround times. Do a change and see what happens. For my colleagues here at Klarna, and some of them are in the room, know that this isn't really true for our system. We have a very long development cycle. So long that it's not really reasonable. Well, doing all the development on a local machine takes a lot of time if you want to really test things. So we have to submit it to some monster machines that does the testing for us. So of course, with long turnaround times, the productivity goes down as well. So I could sort of talk very long time about a lot of the code smells we have in the system, so I'm going to spare you those details. And there was also a rather rigid culture of development, of how development and testing was done. Because, well, from the start, having a rather small system, doing testing at the system level is fine. But when it grows and you can't test parts in isolation, it doesn't really work too well after a while. And then adding more developers, adding junior developers, they will of course tend to look at the code and say, okay, this is probably a good way of doing it, because they don't have the experience to see that it's a bad way of doing it. So they follow the existing patterns and build on the bad stuff instead of getting rid of the bad stuff. And after a while, this means that following these existing patterns will be much easier, even if you're a seasoned, experienced developer, either from outside experience or within Klarna. You'll see that, well, I know that we shouldn't be doing it like this, but you do it just the same because it's so much easier. So again, this descent continues. And of course, what we have then is a technical debt. And technical debt, it's very much like any debt. When people buy a house, they tend to take a loan because they want to have the house now, not just save for like 30 years and then buy the house cash. So it's reasonable. It's a reasonable behavior. But the bank actually wants you, well, probably not actually. Ideally, they possibly should, but at least they possibly should want you to pay off your mortgage. Especially, they will probably be a bit careful about giving you more loans, especially if your income doesn't match. On the other hand, Klarna doesn't really have that problem. They have incomes to match. They have a steady flow of income saying, okay, well, we can buy more developers and our technical debt increases, but sort of nobody really talked about that. Oh, say, hello management, our technical debt is actually increasing somewhat like our revenue exponentially. That's not really too good. And I'd say actually any product will carry technical debt. You will cut corners. Hands up if you have a product that doesn't carry technical debt. No? Yeah, well, me neither, so. And of course, this is due to things like, so taking the loan on the house is like, well, we want to get to the market fast. So rather than building the perfect product now, we build something now, put it out on the market and see what happens. And of course, you will have to adapt your insights which are gained. You have to change directions now and then. And again, it might be faster to cut some corners, it probably is, just to see what happens, than saying, well, okay, we have to stop and redesign the system. And of course, you never actually know where you're going from the start. If you're not building something like an Ada compiler, where you take this really big specification and says, okay, this is what you want to do. When you've implemented everything that's in the specification, you're done. So here's a truth. Solving technical debt is actually trivial. If you have a time machine. It's just sort of, okay, go back in time with your knowledge and do it right. But sorry, time machines seem to be really lost in time, like tears in rain. So I guess we'll have to do something else about it then. And this is sort of where you have a turning point. You have to be open about your technical debt. You have to say, go to the technical debt anonymous meeting saying, oh, hi, I work at Klarna and we do have some technical debt. Because at that point, of course, well, I don't have any 12-step program or anything like it, but actually saying that you have technical debt will make it more easy to solve it or manage it at least. And this is about being open to yourself, actually saying, well, I have cut some corners along the way, but also the team as a whole and management at all levels. If you don't say to management that, well, we actually did this feature quite fast and we cut some corners along the line, they will probably expect that it was done according to best practices and you can build upon it in the future. This is not often the case, so you have to be open to all involved parties about this. And in the long run, when you're developing new stuff, when you're implementing new features, you probably know that you're going to cut some corners, either because you have to deliver on a deadline, or management wants it done really, really fast. And in that case, I say it's very important to make it clear to management that, well, yes, we can do it in a short time, but we will have to cut some corners and we will incur technical debt. So the next time we touch this code, whatever we will do will take longer. So everybody knows that you're actually adding technical debt. Or it could be that getting back on the previous track will take more time than you want. And this increasing technical debt will slow you down over time, but it's not easy to see it actually, because it's gradual, and you might be compensating by buying more developers if you're successful. And of course, even if it isn't increasing, not decreasing the technical debt will actually keep you slow. So this is about measuring. Don't guess. Just saying, oh, well, we have some technical debt. try to measure it in some way. It's not easy, but I'd say you have to try at least to quantify it. And if you can monitor change, you can see that you're actually going in the right direction. Focusing on trends rather than actual values might be more important. See that, well, our technical debt is actually going down, and that will make us more productive. And especially having a team saying, well, we're actually seeing that our technical debt is going down, and then you can ask them, well, are you actually being more productive because of this? And, well, hopefully they'll say, well, yes, actually we are, because they're hitting less of these cut corners, less of these artifacts that are left in the code. But measuring is also about knowing where you have to focus your efforts. It's not just, well, opening a file and saying, well, this is bad, I'll rewrite it, I'll refactor it to make it beautiful. But if this code hasn't been touched for 2 years, there's a good chance that it won't be touched in another 2 or 4 years either. Don't touch it. That's really about being pragmatic. You can have bad stuff which has been lying there, but if it's not changing, just leave it be. Because every change you do will, of course, impose some kind of risk on your system. And running a 24/7 system, well, we want to minimize risks in our upgrades. You can also manage your technical debt by looking at what's ahead and prepare the code for future change, saying, well, in 3 to 6 months we're going to do this, well, let's rewrite this code and see where it goes. And of course, this is doing measurements is Heisenberg and Hawthorne in action. So I guess everybody knows about Heisenberg. So this is a small-scale measurements affecting stuff. Hawthorne, on the other hand, is, if you don't know about him, did measurements on productivity. So this was something like during the 17th century, and they wanted to measure the effect of lighting in the environment on the productivity of workers. So they increased the lighting, and productivity went up. Cool. So that was good. And then someone said, well, what happens if we decrease the lighting? So they decreased the lighting, and productivity went up. Okay, so that wasn't very conclusive. So the only really conclusive from that, from Hawthorne, and this is actually called the Hawthorne effect, is that, well, if people know that they are going to be measured, it will affect their behavior. So if you want to do things like that, you have to do it in isolation. You have to hide the fact that you're actually measuring stuff from the people being measured. On the other hand, doing these measures can have, well, will have effects, and hopefully there'll be positive effects. Because if you have a measurement or a metric, you want to look good according to that metric. So it's definitely a well-known fact that if you have code reviews and they are done in a good way, the people writing the code will actually write better code, because they don't want to be caught out on a code review with trivial stuff. Code reviews should not catch the trivial stuff. It should catch complicated stuff, things that you really didn't think about. But of course, and this is the sort of a backside, the effects are never better than the actual measurements you're doing. Every system, every kind of metric you have can be gamed in any way. So you have to be aware of that, both as when you're doing the measurements, but also if you're being measured. Don't focus on the actual metrics, focus on the sort of idea of the metric. What are we trying to do? And as I said before, trends are often more important than single values, because so what does it really mean that you have 200 or 2,000 violations according to some rule. Well, essentially nothing, but if you 3 months later have 200 violations less, that's probably a good thing. So look at trends rather than absolute values. And things like this, like trying to everything you try to measure is very much long-term. Short-term absolute values don't mean too much. So you should, well, look at trends, but also look at secondary effects. For example, if you're working with increasing code coverage from your unit tests, you have to ask yourself, is this actually resulting in better quality in the live system? Is the work effort being done, does it actually have any effect on the quality? If it doesn't, well, then you either have to increase, well, you have to look at why. Are the tests bad, or are the tests just there to increase code coverage? And of course, it's easy to write tests that just increase code coverage. Don't do any scary stuff like actually asserting anything in them. Just run the code. They actually will have some effect, of course, because doing measurements is, well, running the code at least shows it works in some sense. So, possible metrics then, without actually trying to define things like quality and productivity, which are inherently difficult in our world. Productivity for cars, for example, is sort of simpler because you can count the number of cars that leave the factory each day. Productivity for a software development department is very more difficult to actually define. And so is quality. And when I talk about quality in software development, it's much more about the ease of adaptation rather than the perceived quality for the end user. And then you can do things like, well, static code analysis, measure your dependencies, and this is one of the things obviously I'm doing. Access patterns, records for Erlang. Well, type checking, we have a dialyzer. Code smells, code coverage, just some of the things you could measure. So at Klarna, we do have some tools for this. And one sort of problem with Erlang possibly is that, well, the packet or module structure is flat. So any module can access the exported function of any other module. And that might not really be what you intended from the start. So we've defined sort of additional, externally, it's not any patches to OTP or anything. So externally defined an additional hierarchy where we have applications, but they're not applications in the ordinary OTP sense, but where we call them applications. And an application is a collection of modules. And some of these modules are, for a certain application, is defined as an API module. So another application may only call the API modules of an application. And if not, we call it an API violation. And of course, when people do that, it means they're accessing the internals of another application. And it's a bad dependency because it will be difficult to change the internals. So that's bad. We also have defined layers in the system and how these layers are allowed to call each other. API violations are rather easy to fix because it's about defining APIs and using them. Layer violations, on the other hand, are more difficult. So what this does is, it computes the call graph and then finds the violations according to these rules, according to the defined APIs and the layers. Currently, it works on beam code, meaning that any dependencies injected, for example, through macro expansion will be a false positive, that is, well, a false violation, because the source code doesn't actually have the violation, but the Beam code will. So what's the effect of measuring dependencies like this? Well, the bad dependencies. Well, for one thing, we try to prevent adding new bad dependencies. So in the long run, making the code less badly dependent, and thus enabling more parallel work. And this is done by, well, for the API violations, it would be done by defining APIs and actually using these APIs. For some applications, there weren't any defined APIs at all. For layer violations, and we actually have circular dependencies as well. So that's not too good, of course. More work because you have to move code, you have to refactor it, possibly do it with dependency injection instead of hardwired dependencies upwards, creating circular dependencies and nasty stuff like that. We also have a tool for finding what we call invalid record access. So again, this is about bad dependencies, but on a very more detailed level. This is about actually using actual representation of records in other modules which have not defined them. So it's, of course, the nice thing about using this actual representation is that you can do things like pattern matching and so on. The bad thing is that when, not if, when somebody wants to change the internal representation belonging to an application or a module, well, they're going to see a lot of other code break because it depends on some kind of actual representation. And again, this is about at least trying to prevent additional violations and in the long run getting rid of these explicit record access violations to make the code less dependent. And of course we do we measure code coverage from unit tests, and right now we're just doing it from eUnit, but as said, the system isn't really unit testable because it wasn't built unit testable from the start. It was built more to just test on a system level. So introducing unit tests is slow and is a bit painful. We actually did a slight adjustment to rebar, so we can do some more precise measurements on that as well. So some results then. Well, the people at Klarna will have seen this not once, but several times. This is a graph of our bad dependencies. So the yellow line is the total number, the blue line is the API violations, and the slowly decreasing red line is the layer violations. It's going in the right direction. It hasn't always gone in the right direction. We have had spikes here and there for various different reasons, but it's going rather slow. So this is October 2011, and this is today. This very sharp dip is very artificial, actually. So I should have really adjusted the full graph with that difference, because we adjusted the layered definitions at that point. So but I take responsibility for it. But it was a step in the right direction. Actually, it was killing off an unnecessary layer in the system. So we started out at about 4,000, actually 3,900 violations, but it should be noted that these are unique violations. So the actual number of violations is from the start about 2.5 to 3 times higher, because we have several violations that are identical, but we only count the unique ones. And of course, well, could we go faster? Well, sure we could, but if we go faster, we probably wouldn't have time to actually produce something. And we have to keep the system running, and we have to produce new features. So again, this is about being pragmatic, both in terms of production and in terms of actually going somewhere, and actually reducing your technical debt. And I'd say one way to do this in a good way is to take your development team and then decide on, okay, we put aside 20-25% for reducing our technical debt. And that probably means that you have one person working full-time on reducing technical debt. It's not about saying, okay, hi guys, it's Friday, let's do some technical debt, and everybody gets to do some technical debt reduction for one day. That will never work, because you won't be going anywhere. It has to be done all the time. And the effect of lowering the number of dependencies is that we are increasing the possibilities for doing parallel development. So it is actually getting better. So some results then, well, we have seen the teams that are working aggressively with increasing code coverage, they have a positive effect because they have less incidents in the live system. So that's a very nice secondary measurable effect from the initial effort of actually increasing the code coverage. And I've seen the bad dependencies are decreasing. And it also has a nice effect that the sense of code ownership is increasing. We actually have more than one repository now, which is nice. We have a great number of them. But we still have, for the main system, it's one large repository. And I'd also say that the pride within the teams is increasing, because they feel that, this is our code. We do work with increasing code coverage, and we see the results. And they also see that, well, they have less incidents in the live system that are belong to them. So the perceived quality of what they're doing is actually increasing, which is nice. So some closing remarks then. You will have technical debt. So don't pretend otherwise. And you have to control it. You have to manage it. If you don't, it will control you by slowing you down. And of course, as in any type of optimization, because this is optimization, don't guess, measure. And doing measurements will have effects. So you have to be careful of where you're going. So don't just start to game the system. So there's a lot of work being done to make something look good, but actually doesn't. So you have to measure at several levels. And one of the most difficult things is changing culture, changing the ways people work. It's not just about saying, well, you have to increase your code coverage. You have to make things better. That's very difficult. And of course, as said, we are running something 24/7, but we're also now at the same time building a new architecture to slowly replace. So this is very much like rebuilding a road with all the cars still running on it, which is a nice challenge. But you should be aware that any legacy system you have, and legacy tends to be defined as code that nobody really likes anymore. So I've seen people call code legacy, which was sort of just written 2 years ago, and then say, oh, that's legacy, we really don't touch it. But your legacy system will live a lot longer than you expect, and definitely a lot longer than you want it to live. So even if you are building a new system, you have to take care of the old system until the new system actually can take over. And more interesting reading, if you haven't read up on the term second system syndrome, which is definitely a real syndrome. It's about the problem of rewriting or replacing an existing system with a new one, and what will happen with both the old and the new system. Thank you.
Any questions?
Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you. It was a very interesting talk. We have a lot of the similar problems, and it's quite interesting seeing the way you've approached it. I kind of had essentially a comment and a question. You were talking about gaming metrics,
yeah.
and I think the impression that gives is people intentionally manipulating them. I think it's also worth mentioning that when you set one of these metrics, you're essentially making a statement of this is good. One end of the metric scale is good. So you have a sense of innocent gaming where people are trying to do good by pushing up these metrics. And I think code coverage is one of the ones that's very common, especially if you have simple code coverage. People just try and push the number up without really doing anything useful.
Yes, I totally agree. So code coverage is, well, you can, if it's low, it's bad. If it's high, you really don't know anything if you don't start to look at your tests.
And I guess the other question was, you said on one of the slides that if you don't say anything about technical debt, management take the assumption that you've followed best practices and that everything is all good. Would it not be more realistic to always take the approach that you haven't done this refactoring, and that by default you're always just trying to get to the product, and that you should maybe build into your workflow an entire step for refactoring if that's something that you want? So it's more visible that when I've delivered a product, I've delivered a product. I haven't done cleaning. Cleaning is something that we have to state we should do.
Well, I'd say it very much depends on what level of management you're talking to, because if it's the level of technical management, especially if they are guys with at least some experience in coding themselves, they know that there will be technical debt. If you're talking to 3 guys which knows a lot about economics but nothing about software development, they have no idea. So you have to be very explicit towards the upper levels of management if you're not a sort of a fully technical company, and Klarna isn't.
Thank you, and I'm also looking very forward to the Klarna talk this afternoon about the migration.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay, let's go and eat something.
Yeah,
thank you, Guns.
Thanks.